This episode, I'm joined by John Krummel to discuss Miki Kiyoshi's The Logic of Imagination. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, John Krummel, thanks very much for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
We are going to be discussing Miki Kiyoshi's The Logic of Imagination, which is part of the Bloomsbury Introductions to World Philosophy series. So Miki Kiyoshi, the philosopher, the text is The Logic of Imagination, with a critical introduction by yourself, but also translated by yourself. This is a very erudite, but extremely complicated in all the right ways work. So when I say that there's these four sections: myth, institution, technology, experience, they are very they're interconnected and they're very enclosed, and we'll get to the origin of this book and its genesis and its as a serialized text that was released as these separate sections. But it's for me to sort of state what it's directly, there's no singular thing that I can say. It's from maybe neo-Kantianism, but it's also in relation to Hegel. It's also these connections to Hume, Pascal, Bergson. There's a lot of influences in here. But before we jump into this fascinating book, John, tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and how you came to be this is the first ever translation of this, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So how did this all happen?
Okay. Well, I'm an associate professor of religious studies at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, which is a very small liberal arts school in a town called Geneva, New York. So not Switzerland. It's in the northwestern part of New York State, so it's still about 5 hours from New York City. I've been teaching there for about since 2008, so almost 25 years, I guess. Let's see. Well, I grew up in Japan. I grew up in Tokyo. My father was an English teacher. My mother was Japanese, so I grew up bilingual. I went to an American school there, so my education was in English, but that's where my knowledge of Japanese comes from. Then I moved to the United States to go to college. I went to Earlham College in Indiana, and then I I majored in philosophy. And then I went to the New School for Social Research, studied continental philosophy there, and did a dissertation on Heidegger's interpretation of Kant. And then I went back after that. I didn't feel ready for the job market. So I went back to graduate school and then went to Temple University and got another degree in religion. But at Temple University, I was able to study Japanese, especially Kyoto school philosophy, which was a school of thought that Miki belongs to. And there's a connection with Buddhism. The Kyoto, it's not too evident in Miki, but with Miki's mentors like Nishida, who's and Tanabe, the connection with Mahayana Buddhism is more evident. So there was a person at the religion department at Temple who specialized in that, and I also studied Buddhism while studying Kyoto school philosophy and Nishida, and I wrote my dissertation there on Nishida, and that's been a book version of that was published in 2015, if I remember correctly. And then after that, I got the job at Geneva, Hobart and William Smith Colleges. I guess the way I got interested in Miki, well, first I was interested in the Kyoto School and Nishida, who's the founder of the Kyoto School. The Kyoto School is very fascinating because of the incorporation of Eastern thought together with Western philosophy. Nishida was, I guess I would say, the second generation of Japanese intellectuals who were studying Western philosophy. Western philosophy came to Japan started coming to Japan in the late 19th century when Japan was modernizing and they were setting up modern universities, and the government was sending Japanese intellectuals to Europe and in North America to study in the universities there, and then they were bringing back various Western sciences, and this included philosophy in the academic sense, academic philosophy. So initially, they were studying Western philosophy, the Western canon, starting with the Greeks up to modern philosophy. But Nishida is made a name for himself with his book called Inquiry into the Good, and then his other subsequent writings. And in these writings, he, brought in some Eastern influences too, in dialogue with Western philosophy, German and French and English philosophy. So Nishida, he was hired to chair the philosophy department at Kyoto Imperial University. And so then the group of people surrounding him, his colleagues that he hired, and especially his students, who went on to develop their own unique ideas, they've been given the name of Kyoto School philosophy. And so Miki was one of Nishida's older students, top students. So I was interested in Nishida first. I should say also because of the connection with Heidegger, because I was studying Heidegger first, and then I heard about Nishitani, who was another one of Nishida's students. Who there's a lot of Heidegger influence in Nishitani. He's been translated into English, so he's more well known in the English speaking world. So and I wanted to study Nishitani, but then in order to understand Nishitani, I thought I should study Nishida. In any case, later on, I came to know about Miki, and Miki seemed really interesting because also there's a connection with Marx.
Mm-hmm.
Miki was also interested in Marx, and also I had been working on the imagination. My first dissertation was on Heidegger's interpretation of Kant's concept of the imagination. And I've been looking at various other authors who write about the imagination. And since Miki has this book on the imagination, I started looking at it, and it's been a lot of people consider it to be his magnum opus, even though he never really completed it. He wasn't able to finish it, but I thought it would be worth translating. So I started working on it. It took a long time, almost, I think almost 10 years, just, going over it and revising it. And
is that long? Is there any reason that feels like it was a long time, or is it just a passion project that was every now and again?
Well, I guess both, for both reasons, because it's a difficult text.
Mm-hmm.
Translating Japanese into English, even though I grew up speaking Japanese, it's the two languages are so different. I think it's easier to translate something like German into English. They're more closely related. And yeah, just going back and forth, and I had some help with other people reading the manuscript. I wanted to be accurate, but at the same time, I didn't want to be, if you're too accurate, then it starts to sound clumsy, and it doesn't.
It's easy to it flows and it's easy to read. So it's great.
Okay,
Great
thank you.
translation.
That's good. Yeah, that's the tricky part with translations. You want to find the medium, so that it's not completely off the mark, but yeah, at the same time, so it doesn't sound too clunky.
It's interesting, what you said, and this always seems to come up with the Kyoto School in particular, because Miki studied under Heidegger at Marburg.
Yes.
And so there's always these overlaps, but it seems so the relationship between the two camps, if we want to say the West and then Kyoto School, seems so unbalanced. They took a lot from the West and really maybe incorporated it and developed something from it. And even to today, the West seems very reluctant to really, we've acknowledged it, but it certainly hasn't blossomed as much as like the other way around, if you see what I mean. And so, when I was reading your introduction, you mentioned that Miki was, Miki's a key student of Heidegger's, and he's introduced to Gadamer and he's introduced to Karl Lowith, and you think, man, this is a big deal in philosophy, but where we seem to have not really done too much for the Kyoto School.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I think probably it's going to slowly change. I mean, but it's still a very small number of people in the West who are interested in modern Japanese philosophy, especially the Kyoto School. Yeah. Okay. So the conferences I go to, which specialize in this, like the International Association for Japanese Philosophy, when we have conferences in the United States, then it's just a handful of people.
So after spending, I guess, 10 years with this book, have you got to a point where you can explain it before we delve into its intricacies? How would you describe the logic of imagination?
Yeah. So the logic would be the structure, what the imagination does. He's using the word logic in the same way, similar to how a lot of German philosophers have used Logik, transcendental logic in Kant or Hegel's logic. They're using it in a broader sense than just formal logic, right? Nietzsche also like to use the word logic or ronri in Japanese. So he's using the word logic in a very broad sense, but by that he means, the structure or ordering, the way that the imagination constructs the world. And he's taking off mainly from Kant's idea of the productive imagination as opposed to the reproductive imagination. Except he expands beyond Kant. He also expands beyond Heidegger's interpretation. He's taking off from Heidegger's reading of Kant. Heidegger was interested in the imagination and in Kant, and took that as he focused on Kant's implicit suggestion that it's the hidden root of the faculties, the hidden root of sensibility and understanding. Even though this was a controversial reading, and then for Heidegger, he associated that with temporality or Dasein's temporality. So that would be Miki's starting point, but then he expands beyond that. Expands beyond the epistemological confines of Kant, but also expands beyond the temporal centrism of Heidegger to also associated with praxis, human embodied praxis involving our bodies, and also interactive praxis, with other people. So he brings in the communal or social element, how the imagination communally helps to or takes part in constructing our picture of the world, the Weltbild. And then so then the first three chapters on myth, institution, and technology are three ways or three media through which this happens, the imagination's construction of the world. But there's also an overlap between the three too. I don't think you can completely distinguish them, but
yeah, I mean, I found that the difficulty of drafting these questions was that these are maybe not fully a holistic whole, but there was no real way to a reread is sort of apt to get the full sense of the book because each is connected to the latter. But before, so there's a sort of overview, but equally what intrigued me was I mentioned a few of the influences and the more I went through, the more, I mean, Felix Ravison and Spengler were two that really stood out as Miki is really, cast his net wide for who
Yeah.
he's utilizing to influence his work. So, I mean, Kant, Hume, Spengler, Ravison, Pascal, Bergson, Heidegger,
Yeah.
he's not really sticking to a tradition. And also, I mean, someone like Ravison is extremely unique. So, I mean, is there any thread for his influences, or do you have any thoughts on, what, why a thinker influenced Miki?
Yeah. Well, I still think that the main thread is Kant and Heidegger, you know. And then the other people and I should also say Nishida, his mentor at Kyoto School. Those are the three main threads, and then to that we can add Marx, because he wrote on Marx earlier. There's a little bit of kind of a hidden influence of Marx there, but mainly those three: Nishida, Kant, Heidegger. And then the other people, like the French sociologists, they're helpful in the early chapters, I think, when he wants to find concrete examples for how the imagination constructs the world. And so for that, he looks at Lucien Levy-Bruhl and Tarde and people like that. For the general idea of the ongoing formation of the world, how it's like this force that continues going. For that, someone like Bergson is, there's a Bergsonian influence there. For his ideas of myth, there's Sorel. Even though he doesn't necessarily agree with everything Sorel said, but Sorel's idea of the myth and the will. So he looks at various other thinkers to add on to the main thread of the imagination, which he's taking up from Kant and Heidegger's reading of Kant.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. So jumping back then to the way in which he's using logic as structure, it was tough to find a question to really begin with, but it's this quote from page 32: "The imagination is more originary than reason."
Right.
So how is that to be understood? Is imagination the origin, the genesis of all structure?
Yeah. So it's also good to to think about the etymology of imagination, Einbildungskraft, which encompasses the sense of formation, Bildung, right? And he also, he refers to the word for image in German, Bild. And sometimes he uses the word image, but also he uses the word form image. So these are two different Japanese words, but form image, or keizo especially, underscores the two senses of the German Bild. And also we can go back to the Greek eidos too, has these two senses of image and form. So that's what he has in mind when he is talking about the imagination. It's the faculty for the formation of forms, and this is something that he feels is originary. It functions on a deeper level than in reasoning or understanding. Understanding's on the surface, more on the surface. It extends to our pre-conscious depths, and then especially I think where Miki might be controversial, especially in the latter parts of the final chapter, he starts to talk about how imagination and technology is not just confined to humanity, but nature is technological, and nature is also forming forms in response to its environment. And so there must be imagination operating within nature itself. And by nature, he really means biological nature, so the living organism. So it seems like he thinks of the imagination as something that ultimately functions on a deeper level, deeper than just our intellect, so extending into our biological pre-conscious depths, and also thereby it's also functioning in animals and other living beings too, which is a strange way to think about imagination. But he says that human beings, when we technologically construct the world, we're actually imitating something that nature does, and we're also completing something that nature does. So human imagination is a completion of the natural imagination that's already functioning, operating prior to the human intellect's operation, the human intellect's intentional constructions.
It's an interesting word, intentional. I mean, because Miki has such a focus earlier on what he calls primitive ideas, or what he labels primitive ideas. So there's a whole section on myth, but there is also, he does focus at times on magic and ritual, and they seem to relate to what you mentioned there, the pre-conscious. So this form of imagination, pre-conscious, it appears then that is something that philosophy tends to not like. It sounds a little bit wishy-washy. I'm not saying that, but he's something doesn't have connection to reason, because reason and understanding, as you've said, is after. So it almost seems that reason and understanding solidify whatever this primitive pre-conscious process is. That makes sense, right?
Well, at the same time, though, I should also I think there's also a tension. He doesn't want to only focus on the irrational, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why he says it's a synthesis between pathos and logos. He's afraid that we tend to forget about the pathos, the irrational side, and focus only on the rational side. But so he does want us to acknowledge that deeper irrational side. But at the same time, he says that without logos, pathos alone would fail to create any kind of meaningful coherence. Logos alone would be static. It would not. History would not be moving. There would be no history. So it's the tension between the two, pathos and logos, that creates history and forms. Forms are ongoingly transformed, and any form that's constructed is going to be incomplete or broken. It's never going to be permanent because of this ongoing fluidity. The pathos always undoes what the logos does. So on the one, even though logos gives form to pathos and provides coherence, logos alone can also there's the danger of being sedimented, the sedimentation of logos, which would become ideology. In his earlier writings on Marx, he talked about ideology as the sedimentation or rigidification of logos. So focusing on pathos helps to undo that sedimentation, and it's what kind of makes it more fluid, and so that keeps history moving, So there's always a transformation of forms from one form to another.
And how close is this to Hegel? Because I think a lot of people will be asking, it sounds exactly like
Right,
a
right.
dialectic.
Yeah. So there is an influence of Hegel in general on the Kyoto school, but I think the difference with Hegel, at least for Miki and also ultimately for Nishida too, but in Miki's case, he speaks of a teleology without telos. There is no ultimate telos that's guiding the course of history. So history is always moving and transforming, but it would be impossible to predict where it's going to go. The pathos element of forms is what provides for the novelty and unpredictability. So, things are always changing, and we have our own, human beings they make constructions with certain purposes, but the purposes are provisional purposes or goals or ends, but there's no ultimate final purpose or end that's guiding history as a whole. And also, occasionally, he uses his mentor Nishida's terminology of the nothing, or mu, which was an idea in Nishida's philosophy. He also used to call this the dark, or yami, in his earlier writings. And so this, and by nothingness or nothing or the dark, he meant this underlying formlessness, that's under or underlies the process of formation. Mm-hmm. So, and by that he means basically the unpredictability. There is no ultimate form. So there's always forms are being formed and deformed, unformed, and new forms are being formed, but there's no ultimate form. And so he calls that formlessness. He also calls it the nothing. So this is in contrast to Hegel's idea of the absolute idea or absolute concept, I think.
I'm going to assume this didn't go down well with classical Marxists.
Yeah, right. No, so his, he had a book on Marxist theory that was in the late 1920s, so about 10 years before he wrote this book. And, he was talking about Marx's ideas, but he had his own interpretation of Marx. And, there's still very much this hermeneutical Heideggerian influence, in the way he was reading Marx. And he was interested in political activism. So he had Marxist colleagues, and he helped them in with their journals and things like that. But then he was arrested twice. So the first time he got arrested, it was what was it for? It was for he was accused of donating money to the Communist Party, which had just then been banned. It was actually, the real story was that he was helping a friend who was a member of the Communist Party who was hiding. He was wanted for something, in relation to his activism, and he had he owed the Communist Party money because they gave him money to use it for something, but then he spent the money on his own for himself, and then he needed to pay back the Communist Party, so he asked Miki to help him, and Miki didn't know where the money was going to go to, so Miki gave him the money. And then later, Miki was arrested for supposedly donating money to the Communist Party. But in any case, later Miki said that even though he was interested in Marx, he was never he never considered himself a full-fledged Marxist. He said he was simply writing about Marx as another philosopher. Like philosophers do. It doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with everything. And he also had disagreed with some of the ways that the Communist Party members were interpreting Marx, which he found too rigid. And then a lot of them started accusing Miki. They didn't think he was a real Marxist, and he got kicked out of the journals that he was helping them on. And he one colleague of his, Tosaka, who was also a Nishida student, but Tosaka was more of a serious Communist Party member, and Tosaka accused Miki for being a bourgeois liberal. So so he was never a real Marxist, at least in my understanding. He'd been criticized by Marxists, and he also criticized Marxists himself. Yeah,
it's interesting because you can see the one other aspect of the book that we haven't brought in yet, because we've been painting largely with broad strokes the logic of what imagination is doing, how history moves. But then this all seems very abstract, like great flowing waves so far. But Miki is also interested explicitly in the role of the individual. And so do you see, and what to what extent does the individual play a role in these movements of history, and as an individual? So do you think this is where another place where Miki is moving on from Heidegger? He's taking Dasein and placing it in a much larger scope, because the role of the individual and of history is much more reciprocal. But equally, I can also see that, okay, it's against sort of critical of Heidegger in terms of placing Dasein in a broader scope, but it's still critical of somewhat, a Marxist would imagine it's critical of Marx, because it's a focus on the individual. Yeah,
it's quite complicated, the role of the individual, because on the one hand, he likes to emphasize praxis, the human practice. How history is made through human practice, which on one sense operates through individuals, but also operates through society or communally. On the other hand, because of his influence from Nishida, towards the end of the book, he starts using some phrases borrowed from Nishida when he says that and also I think it might have been in some of his other books from the same period. There's another book called The Philosophy of Technology, which hasn't been translated yet. There's also a book called Philosophical Anthropology, which also hasn't been translated, but they're all from the same period. So it might have been in these other books where he says this, but he says that the world is a self-formative world, and human beings are creative elements or formative elements of the self-forming world. So on the one hand, we go on, making our creations, and we do it as individuals. We might do it as a group, but also in another sense, the world is forming itself through us. So it's hard to really declare, and say that, well, he's for he's an individualist, or that he's a communalist. For him, it's all of these, I think, because he did emphasize the necessity for individual philosophers especially in the 20s, when he was and 20s and the 30s, when he because in the 30s too he was involved in politics too, in a different way, not with the communists, but he emphasized that philosophers should not just write abstract theories, but they should get involved in politics. And that's why, early in the 20s, he was involved with the communists. In the 30s, he becomes involved in a think tank called the Showa Research Association, which was behind Prime Minister Konoe, one of the prime ministers during the 30s, who was more of a moderate, because eventually he gets ousted, and then Tojo, who was more of a militarist, takes over. But they were hoping that Konoe could sort of soften the Japanese imperialism and to sort of direct it in a more humane way. And Miki had more kind of idealistic visions of a pan-Asian cooperative, which is not an empire, but more of the different Asian nations that Japan was already taking over at that time, so that they can cooperate as equals. They called it the East Asian co-prosperity sphere. So he had kind of idealistic ideas of that, which didn't really pan out, because the imperialists and the more hardcore militarists kind of, they actually co-opted that idea of the East Asian co-prosperity sphere to legitimize their own imperialist activities. But, so Miki was, he did believe that even as individuals, we can get involved in politics and try to influence the government. So yeah, it's very complicated. I think it's hard to.
He seems a little bit not antagonistic, but maybe critical of when a will of either side begins to usurp everything. So reason then begins to, as you said earlier, solidify into ideology. It seems that any singular individual will would do the same thing. It's now halting this ongoing process of play, imagination, and actually in instigating its singular will, it just solidifies it down and sort of halts the process falsely.
Yeah. That was his critique of Sorel, who focused on the will. Miki said that, well, the will, operative behind the will is the imagination. So the will is not the ultimate principle. The imagination is what operates below the will. So
everything's downstream from imagination.
I guess it depends on what you mean by downstream, but that does seem to be his ultimate kind of final principle, even though it's a principle that's hard to pin down, because there's still the notion of the nothing, or nothing, the formlessness that imagination is forming forms from out of that formlessness. So, he only refers to the nothing once in a while, but it's there. It's in the back of his mind. I guess it's probably impossible to separate the two, imagination and formlessness. Imagination is the faculty of forms. That's which in itself is inseparable from formlessness.
So what happens when institutions, which is a part of the book that we haven't really touched upon that much, what happens when institutions or maybe even civilizations sort of run dry? I mean, because I certainly feel like the Western civilization at the moment is in a repetitive cycle of the same forms. So in terms of Miki's analysis, have we severed our relationship to formlessness, to imagination? We're just going round and round in, I don't know, a desert of imagination?
Well, that would be his critique of, that would be what, that's what happens when institutions or forms in general become sedimented or calcified. and they become resistant to change. And it's hard to say what Miki would think today, because he died too young. He was only 48 when he died. But um, uh, for example, I mentioned this in one of my articles, but today, with the internet, we see a proliferation of so many different myths, modern myths, and or ideologies competing with each other in all these, like QAnon and different conspiracy theories, and both left and right. And they're all, and I think it's because of the, like you said, the mainstream kind of, um, institutions of the mainstream has been so calcified and rigidified, and they've lost their fluidity or flexibility to respond to what's happening, that now you have all these new myths that are trying to compete with each other, and trying to become institutionalized and trying to be institutions, but it's almost a chaos, as a result, and people get confused, and they don't know who to believe or what to believe.
They don't seem to have much staying power.
Right. Yeah.
Compared, because myths is obviously one of the key sections for Miki. And I mean, what does his understanding of myth sort of differ from what you've mentioned there, and sort of an overarching unconscious, perhaps not ideology, but yeah, a myth, or is it something broader for him? Because he often is a little bit more nuanced with his his understanding of something. It veers off and you broadens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, by myth, he doesn't simply mean something that belongs to the past, or to primitive societies. Myths are still operating today in the modern world, and they move people, and so that's why. And I think also myth for him it's not necessarily negative, not necessarily positive, right? That's why he refers to Horace Sorel's idea of myth as a revolutionary force that can topple institutions, or move people to try to topple institutions. But then also myths themselves can be turned into ideologies, and I think especially in Miki's time and place, Japan at that time in the 1930s, the state had its ideology, national imperialist ideology of what they called national polity, which they made use of the myths of these ancient chronicles, Kojiki and Nihonshoki, which were from the 700s. And these were chronicles that, of these creation stories and mythical histories of the imperial line that can be traced all the way back to the creation of the world from the divinities of Japan. And so the state used that to legitimize the rule of the emperor. The claim was that the imperial line has been has always, it's been ongoing. It's never been interrupted, from the creation of the world up to now. So they use that to legitimize the emperor's rule. And so Miki is very much aware of the mythical nature of that whole ideology. And so there is a kind of a implicit critique. He cannot, directly criticize them, because then he would get arrested, or the book would be censored. But I think there was a kind of an implicit critique, him pointing out that myths are operative today, and And he does mention, was it Alfred Rosenberg's, I think that was his name, Myth of the 20th Century, which uh, was influential with the Nazis in Germany, right? So he mentions that. So I'm sure, he was aware of the mythical nature of the state ideology at the time. And, what this means, for him, myths come and go. They're provisional. They're never going to last forever. And they're not necessarily positive. They can be positive, but they can be negative. And so I think he wanted to point out, show the contingency of of myths. They're powerful, but they're also contingent.
What are
And
sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say they might be loosened too. It might be possible to loosen them, even though he doesn't really provide a real explicit uh, um, prescription for how one might go about doing that.
I was going to ask, what myths do you think Mickey might hone in on that we abide by today, possibly unknowingly? But it makes me wonder, to draw in Miki on technology. I mean, we have a myth that technology will somehow save us and make everything better. Do you see that as one of our myths for today?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question because I actually wrote an article about that. Um, I was wondering what Mickey would think of technology today, especially after the war, because he died right when the war was ending. He actually died right after the war, 2 months after the war, because he was still, everything was chaotic at that time when Japan lost the war. So he was still in prison, and then just due to bad, unhygienic conditions, he ended up dying. Unfortunately, he was 48, but so he didn't really. Uh, as far as I know, I don't think he knew about the atom bomb, what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Um, so it would be interesting to see what he would have said about that, if he had survived. And also, beyond just nuclear bombs, today with AI and everything else going on, iPhones and internet and everything, it would really be interesting to see what Mickey would have thought. Technology was an important, factor in our construction of the world, our being in the world. It transforms the world, it shapes the world, and it also shapes us. So Miki was aware of that, how it's reciprocal. It mediates our relationship to the environment, and while changing the environment, it changes us. He says that explicitly, but especially now, it becomes more and more evident, right? We're very much being transformed by technology. Uh, so I think he would have had some interesting things to say about technology, and also the myth of, as you said, the myth of technology that it's progressive. It's necessarily progressive. I think he would have, especially after the war, he would have been more aware or more vocal about the mythical nature of this idea that technology is necessarily progressive and it's going to always make things better. It might not necessarily be the case, and it could make things worse. Yeah, but it's hard to speculate about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is there anything key you'd like to add about logic of imagination that we haven't touched upon so far?
Let's see. I mean, there's a lot in Miki. What else? I think one thing, I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but there are other philosophers who have been writing about the imagination after Miki, after the war, like Paul Ricoeur, Cornelius Castoriadis. They took Kant's concept of the imagination and broadened it, expanded it. And in many ways, Miki anticipates them, even though they didn't know about Miki. But Miki, in different ways, Miki was saying something similar to what they end up saying later, especially Castoriadis and also Charles Taylor in North America, with his book on social imaginaries. So I think in that sense, it's good to give, or to I think people should be aware of Miki. People who are interested in the imagination and its how it shapes the world and our being in the world should also look at Miki, and not just these Western thinkers, but it's good to be aware of Miki, I think.
How would you advise people to approach this book?
Yeah, well, I guess the first three chapters are kind of the last chapter, which is the whole second part of the book, is more might be more difficult. I mean, it depends on your background, I guess, on the reader's background. The first three chapters are more concrete because they're talking about specific instances, specific ways in which the imagination constructs the world through institution or myth or technology. The third part, the second part, which is the last chapter, the chapter on experience, provides more of a background, ontological background of for the first three chapters. So that's where the references to Kant's first critique, Kant's third critique, also the anthropology in Kant. There's more references to Heidegger, and then also, of course, David Hume, imagination in David Hume. So there's more of the history of philosophy of the imagination in that last chapter, and that sort of so it's, in one sense, it's good to have that as the background foundation for the first three chapters, but on the other hand, it might be more difficult, depending on whether you're familiar with the history of philosophy or not. People who are only more familiar with sociology, for example, might find the last part too difficult and might just want to concentrate on the first three chapters. So so I think it really depends. You could, it's possible to read it in different ways. Also, it's good to know a little bit about the Kyoto school in general too, just to see where Miki is coming from, because also, Miki does make references to ideas coming from Nishida. So it's good, it would be good to be familiar with Kant, Heidegger, and Nishida, but of course, that's not everyone has the time for that. So, it's, at least for the final chapter, there's more of that, the history of philosophy in the final chapters.
Is this the first Miki in translation, or has there been some other things?
There's been articles, shorter translations here and there by other people, but it's the first book translated, and there should be more, but I'm kind of too tired to do translations now. I want to focus on my own writing. So hopefully someone else can pick up the torch to translate.
What is it you're working on now?
Well, there's a lot. I end up working on a lot of things simultaneously, which makes it difficult to finish anything. But at least the first two books I want to complete within the next 2 years, which was a kind of a vow I made to myself. One is a book on the political philosophy of the Kyoto School. The Kyoto School has been somewhat controversial, similar to Heidegger, because of their relationship with the state during World War II, and so I'm looking at the different aspects of this. Nishida's relationship to politics, Miki's relationship to politics. Miki's interesting because of his, it sort of transcends the distinction between left and right. And then I also look at, there's a chapter on the symposium on overcoming modernity, which was also published as an article. That was already published as an article, but I'm going to put that in the book. And then also an article I've already published on another symposium called, what was it? World history, something about world history, which involved a number of Kyoto School thinkers talking about current affairs. And that's been published in Telos. The Overcoming Modernity one was published in a Czech or Romanian journal. I don't remember the name, but in any case, I plan to put those in the book, and then maybe write another extra chapter on something else related to that, maybe the background of all these different ideologies in Japan at that time. So that's one book. Another book I'm working on is on Rainer Schermann, who was my advisor at the New School, who he died. He passed away right after I completed my MA thesis there. So I didn't do my dissertation with him, but he was a Heidegger scholar, but he also had his own interesting, unique philosophy. He's mainly known as a scholar on Heidegger, but he also has a book. So he has a book on Heidegger, but he also has a book on Meister Eckhart. He's also written on people, Plotinus, Foucault. He had a wide variety of interests, but he had this idea called ontological anarchy or ontological anarchy. And he had this notion of the epochs, the history of being, how it shows itself in different epochs according to different principles or archai. But history itself is anarchic because the transition from one epoch to another, when the principles change or the archai change, is itself anarchic. So this is I'm very much fascinated with this idea, and I've written some articles on him, but I want to write more on him and put them together in a book. So that would be something that's not related to Japanese philosophy, even though he did practice Zen, and he's written about Zen a little bit, and he's compared Zen with Meister Eckhart and mysticism, Christian mysticism, which is very interesting. So I'll put that in. I'll write about that too in the book. So those are the two books I'm working on. Hopefully I'll finish within 2 years. Yeah.
Well, both sound fascinating, and I'd love to talk to you about about both. But the second one in particular, ontological anarchism, anarchy sounds fascinating. But in terms of the logic of imagination, I'll be sure to put the link for that in the description below. Mm-hmm. Other than that, seems like a good place to finish up. John.
Okay. Well, thank you. That was fun.